do with common vocabulary. And that has continued to come up over time. And I believe that probably a hybrid approach to that issue is best. I would first say, as terms and jargon comes up that you're not completely familiar with, please speak up. Raise your hand if you're online. Raise your hand here in the room. We don't want to let those opportunities pass us by. But additionally, as we have other educational opportunities that occur in our agendas, in each agenda, be aware that we'll attempt at the beginning of those to kind of set the stage for some of the jargon and nomenclature that may be foreign to some, maybe just a refresher for others. So a hybrid approach to that future agenda item, which is not actually going to be an agenda item, it's just going to be an ongoing process. I would ask everyone to please RSVP. We have obviously the need to develop a quorum, and we want to make sure that we're prepared for who's going to be here in the conference room, as well as who all is planning to attend remotely. Finally, I wanted to let you know that I've asked staff to begin the process of reconstituting our transit subcommittee. Back in the first year of our existence as a CAC, we formed a transit subcommittee, and that committee met only a couple of times before we really ran out of things to evaluate, and so it's been on hold. Now with really a new CAC in place, I'd like for anyone who is interested to respond to the email that'll come out here in the near future asking for interest. So if you're interested, please let Paki know that you are, and we will put that committee back together and let them start their process or whatever process this body wishes to request of them by the end of the summer. So look for that email in the coming days or next week or so. All right, let's dive into our regular agenda. First item I have is the meeting summary from our May 2nd meeting. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Jamie.
I said
Brian?
some corrections, but I'd like to make a motion for
Yeah, please.
and I sent that email to the chair, but there was a motion for just igniting goals that was put forward by Madam Cox, and I seconded it, and Chair Shelburne agreed to consider it for a future agenda. That seems substantive enough that it should make it into something. And then I believe it was you, Chair Shelburne, that asked for a list of prioritized projects at the meeting. Another topic, this topic. And then Rachel Wilson asked for like a running list of suggested agenda items available. So those all felt like substantive matters that you should.
Okay, everyone all right with those? All right,
Mr. Chair?
a couple of questions here, Carolyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I couldn't hear anything that whoever it was just said. I couldn't tell who it was. Does everyone have a microphone and is it on?
No, Abby decided to sit in the far reaches of the room so that no one could hear her, including me.
Mr. Chair, would you like to
Okay,
share the microphone?
Yep.
Do you want me to repeat?
thank you.
mine?
No, that's okay. She had a couple of items that occurred during the meeting that we all agree was were items that had occurred that will go into the minutes or into the summary.
Okay.
And I also have a hand up from Rachel.
Hi, yes, just that I don't want to approve the meeting summary without those items added in.
Right, so the motion on the floor, we can ask if person who made the motion would include those items,
I'll accept the friendly amendment.
and the second agrees as well. All right, any further discussion about the meeting summary? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Well, I didn't actually hear what whoever was talking just said, so I'm not sure what we're voting on exactly. Could we get that into the record for everyone to hear, please?
Do you want me to reread it now that I have a microphone?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll reread exactly what it
I don't know,
said.
who was just speaking just now?
Patricia Schwartz.
Okay.
So this is Abigail Okrent. Can everybody hear me now? Online people, can you hear me? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a yes.
I see
So-
the thumbs up, yeah.
I put forward, thank you for giving me the language, a friendly amendment to include in the meeting summary that there was a motion to revisit the guiding principles made by Amanda Moss, seconded by me, and that Chair McGovern agreed to consider for a future agenda item. Not that there was agreement that would go on, but that it would be considered. Chair McGovern asked for us to receive a list of projects prioritized by jurisdiction. And then Rachel Wilson asked for a running list of suggested agenda items that we could all review. So that was my friendly amendment to the meeting summary notes from May 2nd.
All right, I see Farhad also has his hand up.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, that was earlier procedural. Go ahead, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's confirm that vote, please. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous. Thank you. This is the time in our meeting where we solicit comments from the public. There being no one here in person and no submitted requests for public comment, I'll consider this item closed with no public comments received. Right, item 4 is entitled Review of CAC's Purpose, including Roles and Responsibilities. And I will turn that over to Paki to brief us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me? So I'm just going to briefly review the purpose of the roles and responsibilities. And as you may all have heard, on Thursday, the RTA board met and gave some direction to the CAC, which I think is a positive move for the committee. So we've got some updates for you. So one of the first items that the board directed the CAC to do is to provide a recommended draft plan to the RTA board by July 1 of 2023. So that's just a little over a year from now. The CAC may consider the guiding principles in concert with the Technical Management Committee and submit the outcome of the discussion to the RTA board prior to their August meeting. And the packet for their August meeting goes out on August 18th of this year. So we will be asking the CAC to have that discussion. So I think this is, again, a positive thing for the committee. I know this is something that the committee has been wanting, and the RTA board did say they wanted the CAC to consider those. Because of the time frame, the first meeting in July will not occur because it falls on the 4th of July. So for this reason, we're planning as of right now to have a second meeting in June. So that will be on June 20th. I'll be sending out more details, but I just wanted to get it to you now because I know it's summer. But this will give you the opportunity to start having those discussions about the guiding principles. The sooner the better. Also, RTA staff, with the direction from the board, will be coordinating extensive public outreach for the draft plan after the board approves it for public feedback. Additional direction from the board is that the RTA board will determine and provide the CAC a budget. And this, of course, is based on the RTA tax rate, as well as all projected revenue source estimates. The CAC will use this to program funding in the draft RTA plan and include established a percentage range of funding for each of the elements. So for example, there'll be, X% for named projects, X% for transit, X% for other elements. So just to give you an idea of how it'll look. The RTA board will also decide and provide direction to the CAC on possible use of the RTA dollars for maintenance in the next plan. So that's another item of discussion. So where we are in the RTA next plan development process is in phase 3. This is where you're starting to review and narrow submitted project lists. You're working with the TMC, you're aligning projects to meet the goals, and then you're balancing the funding needs per element. And this, again, is based on the RTA board established budget. So the purpose of this committee, the CAC, is to provide input on the development of the next RTA plan for the RTA board consideration and the eventual voter approval. The draft will align with RTA statutes and board policies. The CAC has adopted a framework to guide development of the plan using the following elements: corridor, transit, safety, environmental, and economic vitality. And again, this is not the guiding principles framework, this is the elements framework, just to clarify. Also, projects, as you know, have been submitted via the TMC members at the request of the RTA board and CAC. Later in the agenda, you'll be getting a TMC update and with more detail on that. In terms of RTA board responsibilities, the board will be providing a budget for your draft plan, providing direction on possible use of RTA dollars for maintenance in the next RTA plan, direct funding set-aside amounts for current plan overlap needs, and also providing additional direction. In terms of the budget for the draft plan, the RTA board will be determining and providing you, the CAC, with a budget based on the RTA tax rate, as well as projected revenue source estimates, as I mentioned earlier. So again, the responsibilities of this advisory group is to act in an advisory capacity by providing initial input as representatives of the public about the region's transportation needs, and to determine which RTA investments would most likely be supported by the voters. During this phase, there'll be 8 steps that the CAC will be taking. The first is, as I mentioned earlier, consider the guiding principles in concert with the TMC. Again, this will be due before August 18th of this year to be included in the August 25th packet, to be included in the packet for the August 25th board meeting. And again, we'll be setting up the next June meeting for that. The second step is to review the submitted projects. Projects, as you know, were submitted at the request of the RTA board and CAC. And the last item in the agenda today, we've reserved a full hour so that you can go, it'll be an overview of all the submitted projects. The third item is to receive technical and policy feedback from the RTA Technical Management Committee and from RTA staff. The fourth item is that you'll be preparing a fiscally constrained draft plan based on projected revenues. These will be provided by the RTA board, and the projects in the plan will be supported by an RTA excise sales tax. Just as a reminder, the plan and the tax will be separate ballot initiatives, but the CAC will be focused on the plan development aspect. The fifth step is to review and select projects that align with the RTA statutory requirements and the RTA board's policies and direction. The sixth step is the RTA will confirm anticipated non-RTA revenue sources that may supplement the proposed projects. And then the seventh step is to prepare a preliminary draft plan. Again, this will be coordinated with the Technical Management Committee, and then you'll be recommending that draft plan to the board. And then the final step is to provide the recommended draft plan to the board by July 1 of 2023. So just to briefly go over each of the steps, again, you're going to be submitting the outcome of the discussion in coordination with the TMC about the guiding principles to the RTA board before August 18th of this year. For reviewing of submitted projects, throughout the process, the CAC is asked to review the projects and you'll be assessing transportation needs. 108 projects have been identified by member jurisdictions as their priorities, and they've been submitted through the TMC. Overall, the cost of the submitted projects is roughly $4.6 billion. And the anticipated available funding for RTA Next is about $2 billion. The CAC task is to review the submitted projects and determine which ones may be supported by the voters. In terms of technical and policy feedback, the CAC will be seeking technical feedback from RTA staff and the RTA TMC. For policy feedback, staff will provide the RTA board policy direction and/or seek clarification from the board as needed. If a current policy does not exist, staff may seek direction from the RTA board. To prepare a fiscally constrained draft plan, the CAC's responsibility is to develop a program of multimodal regional transportation investments that's fiscally constrained. The projects in the plan will be supported by an RTA excise sales tax, which again requires separate voter approval. The plan will use a mix of funding sources. Non-RTA funding commitments will also be secured. And again, must be fiscally constrained. Also, the CAC will receive direction from the board on all policy matters, as well as on a budget based on revenue projections to use for the development of the next plan. This direction from the board will include determination of the tax rate and any set aside revenue for the implementation of the current RTA plan projects that the board may want to include. And you'll find out a little bit more about that in our next agenda item. In terms of selecting projects that are aligned with statutory requirements, they all must be aligned with those requirements as well as with the RTA board's policies and direction. There will be recommendations that will be in compliance, or any of your recommendations need to be in compliance with Arizona state statutes, as well as the board policies outlined in the current administrative code. Information will be provided from RTA staff and from the board about ongoing review for alignment with the RTA statutory requirements and those policies and directives for plan development as needed. The RTA will confirm anticipated non-RTA revenue sources that may supplement the proposed projects. What the RTA board can do is include an overlap funding amount in the first 5 years, in the first 5-year period of the new plan. So for example, right now the current plan ends in 2026. As an example, the new plan begins in 2024, then the overlap period would be from 2024 to 2026. The board will also develop a targeted budget for the proposed new plan based on anticipated mix of new RTA and committed non-RTA revenues. You will then be preparing and recommending a preliminary draft plan, again, in coordination with the TMC. Once the board reviews and approves the initial draft plan for public feedback, then RTA staff, with direction from the board, will coordinate extensive public outreach for the draft plan, but only after the board approves it for public feedback. And then finally, you'll be providing a recommended draft plan. Again, the CAC, you will be submitting this recommended draft plan by July 1 of 2023. The RTA board will review and approve it for public feedback. Based on that public feedback, the draft plan may be revised as directed by the board. Upon further direction, then the CAC will coordinate with the TMC to make a final recommendation to the board. In the meantime, the RTA board will seek member feedback endorsements before the final approval, and then they will set an election date upon plan approval. And those are the steps, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Bruce.
Thank you, Pakia. It's very helpful. I have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. The first is respect for talking about the principles. I think we're going to need more than 1 or 2 meetings to do that. So it seems to me that we ought to be planning for meetings in June and for the balance of July if we're going to meet that August 18 date, because I suspect there's going to be a lot of discussion about those principles. Second issue, I noticed that there were three parts of the budget that the RTA board is going to group our discussion into, and the last one was other elements. And so there are some policy implications in those other elements related not just to maintenance, but do we have flexibility in reserving dollars that are not assigned at the beginning of the budget of the process that could be available for projects that are not anticipated going forward? We've talked about that in the past, and we need some direction, it seems to me, from the RTA board on that issue. And secondly, I've raised the issue repeatedly about advancing technology and how that may impact this, and what are the policy guidelines about us considering a technology component and those other elements. And then the third area that I'm concerned about is we receive road projects only. I'm not aware that we've received other projects from the jurisdictions regarding wildlife corridors or pedestrian or other kinds of things. That would considerably exceed the 4.6 billion that we already have. And how are we going to consider those projects? Are they going to be brought forward to us by the jurisdictions? And is the board going to give us some policy direction on how we treat those issues? So I think in each of those three areas, we still have some unanswered questions. And before we can make some real good decisions on this, we need that guidance, or at least to understand what our discussion process ought to be about those items.
Yeah, all great points. Thank you, Bruce. I think before we get into, sorry, Diane, but before we get into a longer discussion about some of these policy and or CAC responsibilities, I see Farhad has his hand up, and also wanted to let you know that General Ted Maxwell, one of the members of the RTA board, is with us and has some comments as well. Farhad, do you want to weigh
Yeah,
in?
thank you, Mr. Chair. That's really the reason I raised my hand, was to introduce General Maxwell and hopefully provide an opportunity for him to make his remarks, and then we can open it up for questions.
I think now would be a great time for that. Thanks, Farhad. General Maxwell, enlighten us, please.
Enlighten us. That's a dangerous statement. That's for sure. Well, first off, I wanted to thank everybody for being on the Citizens Advisory Committee. It is a lot of work. I think there's been stuff that we as a board have not been providing enough information on, and things such as the deadline. It's going to kind of help you get a little bit more focused on what you want to do. But you are the citizens' voice in this process at this point. There will be extensive, and I mean extensive, citizen outreach at some point. But one of the reasons that we want to ensure that the makeup of the Citizens Advisory Committee not only mirrored or came closer to the community with regards to the municipalities, the diversity of modes of travel and other issues, was because you are the citizens' voice. So there's been a lot of concern on how you're going to bring the citizens' voice in it. The big one is let people know that you're involved in this, talk to them, and then bring their voices and their opinions to the table. There won't be time, my belief, and I think you're already starting to address that. I heard Bruce already mentioning having multiple meetings before August 18th. The timeline's tight, and it's tight for a lot of reasons. The board has not set a firm date on when we'd like to go to the ballot, but I think everybody's aware it expires in 2026, and we know we don't want to butt up against that. You can look just north to Maricopa and see how they're right now coming up against their deadline, and it's starting to become a worry to many people, especially as operations and other fiscal impacts would occur if they don't get it done in time. My purpose for being with you today is one, to thank you again for your service, but also thank you for your outreach. We've gotten a lot of information, and we knew that item 8 was a significant one that was troublesome to a lot of the folks who are serving on the Citizens Advisory Committee. That's one of the reasons we brought forward a motion that would give you more guidance without coming across as restricting. We do want you to continue to talk about ideas and think out of the box, but at the same time, we all need to be aware that July 1st, 2023 is when we expect to have a draft plan from you if possible. Shouldn't even throw out the if possible. The reason we selected that date is that gives the most amount of time for the extensive public outreach to occur before we have to, in conjunction with the CAC and the TMC, have to come up with a final plan that's going to go in front of the voters. kind of humorously, I'll say July 1st is kind of our deadline we've given for you in 2023. If you want to get it to us earlier, to open up the opportunities for the citizen input and outreach. Remember, last RTA had 20 town halls and almost 200 community briefings. So when I say there will be extensive outreach with the citizens to give them an opportunity to give more input, we will, but we really rely on the members of the Citizens Advisory Committee to be bringing those kind of concerns and what the communities want and desire into these discussions now. The other reason I wanted to come talk to you is just to make sure you understood and you had an opportunity to ask me if there's any clarification on what was decided at the board meeting. Paki, I've covered the big items, and I'll kind of run through some of those without hopefully taking up too much of your time. The discussion on the citizens of the guidelines, the CAC guidelines and principles, those are your guidelines and principles. They are developed by you. We asked at the meeting if they were approved by the board, and that's not the case. These are to be used by yourselves. And the reason you can consult with the TMC is because if there's some of the principles and guidelines that just aren't technically possible, then you have to be aware of that as well. So we wanted to give you some time to do it. We'd like what we've asked for is that you'll have those new recommended changes or your changes to them back to us and by the August meeting, so that at that point you can use those going forward. Remember, those guidelines will allow you to create goals for the plan you are putting together. Those goals are not always in collaboration with each other. There's some you read the goals and you go, they may not quite fit with some of the other goals we have, but that's because every project's not going to meet every goal. But what should meet every goal is that the overarching plan does not violate any of those goals when it's looked at in its totality. So I know you've been wanting to talk about those issues, and I think you need to do it as part of the collaboration and coming together as a group, because there's no more important group when this final plan's done than the Citizens Advisory Committee to help go out and start selling it to the community, why it's good for everybody. The money, that's obviously one of the big issues. And I've seen numbers between 1.5 billion and $2 billion is what we will probably forward to you when we come up with a number. And it is the number that we'd like to bring the draft plan back in constraints with. And it's a challenge. You've got $4.5 million or $1 billion of projects already on board. You're going to have to cut those down. And as Bruce Wright just pointed out too, there's a lot of other issues that there's the money hasn't even come forward with yet. We've committed as the board to give you that objective funding number, as well as give you the percentage breakdowns within some of the elements. Bruce brought up a great point again. Yes, he was the only one that was allowed to talk before you guys decided to let me talk. So there are some things in there that aren't discussed. We talked about there is the potential to put technical advance money to the side, to put a pot of money for that. There's potential to do a review. One of the things we've talked about, the first 20-year plan was really hard. There was no review points. Well, that's got to be built into the plan that we're going to go forward with as well. So I hope you can count on those of us on the board to continue to push to provide you as much data and information as you need. And when things like the ones that Bruce mentioned do come up, we expect your chairs to bring those issues back to the board as well. The conversations, just because we gave some guidance doesn't mean the conversations are over. They won't be all the way through this process. Real quick, I want to take a side note on that one. The confidence that all the board members unanimously displayed in the current chairs for the board, who will continue through the remainder of the RTA next CAC process, is extremely high. I think many of you have seen Chair McGovern bring back to the board what your thoughts and concerns are. I have not had the opportunity yet, and I will, Mary, promise I'll reach out to meet with you soon to talk, but I've sat with Carolyn Campbell and spoken. You've got three good chairs who all understand the needs and desires in this community and want to take it forward. So leave no doubt that they're the chairs for the long haul, and the board has reaffirmed that. The discussion of maintenance goes kind of to a point of the elements. Right now, or wasn't a maintenance element. There may not be one, but we don't want you to spend any really much time discussing or worrying about that yet. We're going to get you an answer on that soon because there's not yet an agreement amongst the board on if maintenance occurs, what it should occur for. Is it RTA only projects? It's individually providing funds to municipalities, or does maintenance really belong, or should it be a separate question? So that is one issue that at this point, I'd really encourage you not to worry about yet. You will have those answers soon before. It should not, and it shouldn't impede any of your other processes that you need to go through now. The toughest one, and sometimes it's the one we all get bogged down on, is the projects. You've got 4.5, you've got basically double, if not 3 times as many dollars expected for the projects that have been proposed, and you need to go through that. So I would personally encourage you to make sure a little bit of time each meeting is geared towards not solving that final project list, but starting to take it from 108 down to what you may see as a viable number with a viable dollar cost that would work. You can always add some back that you've taken out. You can always, there's going to be new projects that may be proposed by the municipalities, by some of you through the process. Just make sure that the municipalities that are ultimately responsible for any projects that are coming forward need to be brought into that discussion as well. And then the last thing I want to do is just real quick, the board voted to move 2 projects out of RTA 1 and into RTA Next. I know there seems to be a lot of confusion on what those leftover projects are. Remember, there's 2 years of overlap. There's 2 years that we are going to, if, for example, we go to the voters in November of 24, there's 2 years of RTA 1 that are basically now part of RTA Next. So the 2 projects that have been moved forward were both moved forward by recommendations of the municipalities responsible for it. Silver Barrel Road project, and then the First Avenue project from Orange Grove to Ina. Both those had full support of the municipalities. We still need to identify about $100 million that we think ultimately will be the amount required to move into RTA Next and let everything stay on schedule. And those all are City of Tucson projects. So with the City of Tucson and the RTA staff will look at trying to identify those projects as well. The promise the board has made, and we've actually all come to agreement on, is that those will be front-loaded projects in RTA Next, and they will not be considered in the overall total of RTA Next projects when we start talking about what percentages the different municipalities got. So as you know, when this plan, when you create it, will be broken down by municipalities, by different sectors of transportation, different goals, objectives. It will be broke down and analyzed a lot. Well, those 3 projects that are, or however many projects end up being carryover, are all part of the original RTA and will not be included when we look at that data breakdown of how the projects going forward were done. So we also promised that they would be done right away. So yes, those will end up, whatever money's needed for those projects will come out of the final dollar amount that we propose moving forward. But they will not be considered RTA Next projects in that manner. So, and I'm open for any questions that any of you may have of me, or I'll just hang on through the rest of the discussion on this part. But again, appreciate all your passion and all your willingness to speak forward for all the things that you feel are valuable to the community, because you represent the citizens, and we're looking forward to it. It's a lot of work. I know monthly meetings probably aren't going to work, and maybe not all the same times will work either. But if all of you continue to try to work together, I think you'll be able to make good progress. And I appreciate your leadership and commitment to this.
Thanks so much for those comments, Ted. I see Ramon Ganders has his hand up. Go ahead, Ramon.
Ramon, please unmute.
Sorry about that. Ted, thanks so much for being present today. The question that I keep getting from people I'm talking to I know we're under a constraint, right, to go to the voters by a certain time before this expires, but has there been any talk or consideration about a possible recession and how this may impact going forward? Obviously, I know nothing's been said about anything yet, but I think there's a lot of fear in terms of folks I talk to and how that might relate to a potential election into the future.
Well, it's obviously always a consideration. You look at, we talked about at the board meeting last week a little bit about why is there a shortfall this year? Obviously, the recession of 2008 impacted the funding for the original RTA. But also, I think there was acknowledgement that maybe our estimation of what the inflationary factor might be through time would bring to us on total dollars fund, maybe a little bit higher expectation. So I know that the RTA staff and team is looking hard at trying to make sure that whatever number we suggest going forward will be one that we believe is attainable. 20 years is a long plan. That's why I think it's important that this plan does have periodic updates and points to take a look at it. Some of the projects that were originally designed for the last, quarter of the original RTA, some of the growth numbers and traffic flow didn't occur. Sometimes the dollars aren't there. Sometimes the cost of goods are going, right now we're experiencing huge increases in the costs of the supplies. I think if we build this RTA Next plan and have points throughout the plan that we can do assessment for the upcoming or the follow-on projects, it will give us a lot more flexibility. A recession right now obviously would be very hard on the citizens to vote for a plan like this. And I think that's why we have to make sure we've got some flexibility built into the plan.
Thank you. And Amanda Moss.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks General Maxwell for coming and speaking to us today. I had two questions that I was hoping you could help us with. One is, what happens to those two leftover projects if the RTA Next doesn't pass? I can start with that and then to ask you my second.
I'd probably turn to the executive director a little bit more, but the intent is if this doesn't pass, we've still got 2 more years of collecting the tax. And at that point, we have to decide as a board what we're going to do to try to finalize those. That's why it's so important for us to have support of the municipalities to say, we're willing to move these projects forward. I'll talk specifically about the Orange Grove the First Avenue from Orange Grove to Ina. That was a project that the county, upon further review, 15 years after they proposed it, decide they don't like how it's broken out now, and they'd really recommend not doing it versus, correcting it. This is going to give them an opportunity to take a look at it. What will happen if there's projects that we move forward that we want to get done, then we've got to look at the financials, and the RTA still collects its tax till 2026, and it would still be moving forward. And then at that point, the municipalities, PAG, there's other ways that we could try to get those to completion. It just wouldn't be under the guise of the RTA. And
Okay.
Farhad, you want to make sure I didn't say anything out of bounds on that one?
No, thank you. That was right on point. So the legislation, the way it's written, if RTA Next does not pass, the board still has authority to spend RTA dollars on all the projects in the current plan. Obviously, beyond 2026, we've had that conversation before. So the board has the authority to spend those dollars on those projects if they do not pass as part of RTA Next.
So if it doesn't pass and that there's a possibility that voter approved projects will not occur, is that accurate?
No,
go ahead.
Sorry, RTA Next is a standalone plan. If RTA Next does not pass, that's a separate plan, but the current RTA is still viable, and any revenues collected through the current RTA can be spent on current RTA projects, even if they were recommended to move to RTA Next.
Yeah. Okay. And then my other question, how can, General Maxwell, you talked about reviewing projects and the importance of doing that at this time. but you also acknowledged how the board said that we can revisit and update the guiding principles as needed, and that, you know, we're essentially the CAC and can do what we need to do to prioritize projects. So I guess the question, I would be really sincerely looking for your guidance on how we're supposed to review projects when we don't really have a clear lens in place. You know, we're not sure on our guiding principles. We don't have goals. We don't have clear definitions such as regional needs. We also don't have the updated roadway project dollar amounts to account for all the skyrocketing inflation that has been occurring. So, I mean, I guess I'm just really curious, like, how can we reasonably review these projects, and should we be spending time at this moment looking at those projects, given we don't have a lot of infrastructure in place to be doing that type of evaluation? So any guidance you have on that is much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be real blunt on at this point is I think you've got a lot or most of the information. Let's talk about the guiding principles. Whether the CAC comes together as a whole on each and every guiding principle, and we've talked about the ones that have been brought forward predominantly by the new members of the CAC. The first part of reviewing the projects is just that, learning about them. I mean, I'll be real honest, I've not reviewed myself with every project that's been pushed forward yet and could not make that decision. So I don't know if you'll be asked in today's meeting when you go review those projects, what you need to cut or what you don't need to cut. I do think it's important for you to get the guiding principles. That's going to lead to some of the goals that are going to impact it. And I think you're absolutely right. And until you have that discussion, you can't get to really curtailing or knocking a lot of the projects off the list. But you may be able to reduce some, or you can definitely take the time to get smarter about them so that when you come into the next meeting or a meeting sometime in the future, you'll already have some semblance of what the projects are behind you. And you won't have to start there and then take some time to think about, know what you're doing forward. It's not easy. I'm going to be real honest with you, Mas. It's not easy. But I think that the guiding principles are just that, their goals and their objectives. It's even if some of the items that different people want, I'll tell you that I was on the CAC when we created the first guiding principles before I got appointed to the State Transportation Board. There was things I would have liked on those guiding principles that didn't exist. It doesn't mean I'm not going to think about them when I was then looking at the different projects either. You know, the guiding principles are really helping you establish those goals that when you look at the package as a whole, you can say we address those issues.
Thanks for that comment. We'll be talking more about this in item number 6 as well. So plenty of time to discuss our path forward, I guess. I have a question here in the room from Diane. I did. I don't know if I stalled long enough that you forgot.
I still remember my question. Thank you, Chairman McGovern. I just want to go back to your comment earlier at the very beginning about defining our terms. And I think this is so basic that I'm almost embarrassed to ask, but is there a difference between the public and the voters as we're considering these projects? What's the majority of the voters and what percentage of the population is that, as opposed to the public that will be using these projects?
So I think that's one of the challenges, because the fact of the matter is, of course, in my opinion, there is a difference between what they may view as the regional goals, regional objectives. I'm betting that if you talk to each one of the municipalities, they've got different opinions of what the regional goals and regional objectives are. So that's why if you're looking for an exact definition of one, it's not going to be there. That's why you all represent the municipalities, the people, and the voters in these discussions. There's some of the terms that we're looking for hardcore, fast definitions. They're going to be different to each and every one of us. And that's why I think I wouldn't get too bogged down on that to prevent you from going forward. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have some of the folks come in and talk to you about what the different terms and how they view them. But like most things with us in our society, everybody views everything a little differently, and we can use the exact same language and it's not going to be the same. And I'm betting that even 35 of you could not get to 100% agreement on exactly what a definition of something should be. But that's why it's a collaborative effort and discussion. And there will be a lot of give and take through your process. I have no doubt about that. But again, I think it's important to keep this process moving forward as best you can. And I know I'm probably speaking for the folks that have been part of this group already for 3 years. They're ready to move forward as well. But first thing, the reason I think that I personally believe the guiding principle discussion is important is that's going to help you come together as a whole better. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, Diane, but
I have a question. When you get to it.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, the question I have is, I just for a point of clarification, that that Orange Grove to Ina project, did I hear you correctly say that if the municipality or a partner does not want to do the project, you do not have to do that project?
I'd have to turn that one back to the executive director. If one of the municipalities came in and said the project's not going to be done, I don't know where we go from there.
Sure, thank you. So again, Tom, going back to what the voters approved in 2006, and specifically for that project, the recommendation was to widen the road. Currently, Pima County is asking to use the existing cross section of the road, and they do not anticipate the additional traffic volume to widen the road. So that's one of the reasons they even came back and they recommended that, because that is a significant change, that would be ideal candidate to go into RTA next for voters to hopefully approve that change. And that's really the process that we're recommending at this point, that if you're going to make a change that is that significant, then the voters get an opportunity to vote on it with RTA next. And as the question came up earlier, depending on the outcome of that election, then the board has the authority to make a decision whether to move forward or not with the project.
Okay, now just to kind of follow up, because does that mean that any project that the voters have approved, big or little, that they no longer can support, would not be done? And the reason I'm saying, I think it's critical that what the voters approved get done, or that there be a substitution perhaps for that project that may go forward with that money. Otherwise, we get ourselves into the same position that bond proposals have gotten into. Promise the public to deliver something, and then at the end of the program, it's not there. Now, I realize it's a little bit more complicated situation here, but nonetheless, I don't want to go before the public and support this program without saying that we were not able to produce what they approved or some reasonable alternative.
So Tom, I apologize if I muddied the water on that one. This one was really based on the discussion that I think a lot of us believe there will be an RT next. And so we're looking at how to make the transition from now to then. What would more than likely happen is if they did decide they didn't want it, they'd come back with us with an alternative proposal. But ultimately, you're right. The voters approved it. It's there. For all intents and purposes, every effort's going to be made to deliver what they voted and approved on. That's why I think including points throughout the next 20-year plan where we can do assessments on projects will be extremely helpful when it's going. And if the change is so significant, we have to go back to the voters, 10 years from now on a single project, then that's a possibility. But as it's written right now, Pima County has got a desire to do that a little differently. They're good with taking it out of RTA, the original RTA, and putting it into RTA next as one of the front-loaded RTA 1 projects.
And if I may add to that, again, Tom, you're really phrasing it the same way as we are looking at it, that if there's a change proposed, you want to take that change back to the voters, and that's what the board agreed to do, to bring those two projects that are proposing changes for the voters to make that determination.
Okay, I would just like it very distinctly mentioned somewhere in the next vote or whenever you take that vote, that this is not that you just don't feel like I know, the answer is you just don't feel like doing that project, but there's a very legitimate reason for not doing that, and therefore you're proposing an alternative.
I think this also gets back to the question of flexibility of a plan as well, and how we're able to craft something that is understandable to the voters and acceptable. I wanted to check and see, Justine, you had your hand up before. Did your question get asked and answered? She may have had to step aside. I've Carolyn, your hand is up. But you're muted.
I keep trying to unmute on my picture, and that's not where you do it. Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chair. And General Maxwell, thank you so much for coming and talking to us and spending so much time with us today, because there have been questions, a clarification, and et cetera. First, I wanted to mention something to Moss. Moss had asked about the terms and the vocabulary which has come up, and I believe what Chair McGovern was saying at the beginning of the meeting was that hopefully we won't need an agenda item to talk about, just to go over the vocabulary, but instead, whenever we need to hold time at a meeting and figure out if we have a common understanding of those terms, we'll just do it. So it might make each meeting longer, but we thought that would be more advantageous than to have take a whole meeting. But if we need to, I'm sure we will in the future. And then General Maxwell, I did have a question. I want to make sure that Bruce's question was answered, because well, this has come up many times too. We are told that we need to approve, or at least review and prioritize the road projects before we move on to other categories. And we, many of us think we should be looking at that holistically. And as Bruce said, I mean, flexibility is something I think that you as the board and many of us hopefully will have some input in, but Bruce has come back many times talking about technology and either how do we fit that into our plan, or do we have a special category for it? And then transit, which some may be named projects and some might not. We haven't, and that's not in this, but we do have the transit subcommittee getting started again, but some of the other projects too. How do you see us? Would you rather have us do all of the road projects first and set them aside and then bring in other aspects of this kind of holistic plan?
Well, now I'm going to speak from my opinion, not necessarily the unanimous consent of the board. And that's where I get the executive director. He's getting nervous right now. I know it. So here's my take, Carolyn. I trust the chairs to be able to set and have input and set the agenda to cover them at the appropriate levels. I think the biggest concerns from folks always go back to those projects just because there's so many of them and there's so much. What we need to do as the board is provide you with those, we can give you the total budget. Hey, we'll just, for discussion purposes, $2 billion is going to be what we want you to fit everything in. And then we need to, it's got to be on us to give you buckets. So is it 45 to 55 for projects? And that's all sorts of projects, whether they're transit projects or road projects that actually fit in there. Is it, 25 to 35% for transit? We've got to give you the answers to include maintenance. And Bruce, I'm going to take it back to the board to include technology, because that is something that there hasn't been anything. We always like to, when you're going to the public, you like to be pretty firm with, what it is that it's going to go to. Well, if we set aside a bucket for technology, that's going to be coming forward in the future. Some people will maybe not like that idea. Others might like it, but it's something that the board hasn't talked about. But I think technology very easily could become another element or bucket for you to work within. But as far as, do I personally see you finalizing all the project road lists and then talk about the others? No, I think it is too much of a entire package. And even with the numbers we're going to give you from the board's probably not going to be this exact amount and this exact amount. It's going to be buckets, ranges that we'd like you to keep it in. Obviously, it goes back to those regional needs. Everybody thinks differently about them. And so I would not personally believe that the best way to approach it would be to talk only one at a time. The key will be, and this is where it all falls on the chairs, is the chair's ability to stay on time, on target with the agendas as you go through to ensure that you're actually making progress and not any one of those areas is getting bogged down and stuck and holding up the entire system.
Wow, what a great segue. Speaking of items bogging down the schedule of the chair.
That I figured.
So much for that. I have had one hand up for quite a while. This will be the last one, and then we'll move on to our next item. And let's hope it's not a half-hour question, but no pressure, Ava. What question do you have?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Thank you, first of all, Chair McGovern, for representing us to the board as the committed citizen voters that we are. And thank you, General Maxwell, for coming. This has been very, very elucidating. I appreciate the clarity. One of the ways in which I envisioned this possible project management to proceed would be through having a deep dive on the goals and then creating a weighted tool based on that deep dive that we can then apply to all of the projects and see where they come out in terms of that ranking. And then we could just add and subtract as we need to, right? If we had a tool established. So it sounds like we are able to do a deep dive into our goals and be able to talk about what a tool might look like based on how we value and weight those goals. But for that to happen by August, I think would be pretty difficult if we don't split into subcommittees, which would allow us to have these deeper conversations and not just on this, once a month basis, especially with summertime. I think we're going to have problems to be able to cover that kind of ground when a lot of people are probably traveling. Is there a way for us to break into subcommittees and do a deep dive on these priorities and start talking about what the scaffolding for a weighted tool might be?
It could be, Ted, if you don't mind, I'll take this one. It could be that a subcommittee will be necessary. One of the things I was going to and will again talk to everyone about is some homework. Talking about learning all we can about these projects as they've been presented. Obviously, at the same time, we'll be developing whatever changes we may need to the guiding principles. But during this time, when Rick presents those 108 projects and we begin to study them, I want everyone to really be thinking about and seriously considering how we should rank them, how we should grade and classify those projects so that we can develop the kind of tool that Ava is suggesting, I think. So that's absolutely something that I'm going to be pushing us toward. But I need y'all to be aware that that will be happening and that you have that in the back of your mind as we're going forward here in the next couple of meetings at least.
I'd also like to suggest field trips. I would really love to have field trips so we can go to each of these project sites, because the public, you always hear this from the public. Well, people sitting behind desks making decisions about, places, things they don't use in places they've never been. It would be amazing if we could actually say, okay, we did at least divide and conquer and do field trips to some of these project locations and experience them ourselves and say, yes, indeed, we know what this is about.
A great comment. And should we end up with a subcommittee, that may be something that subcommittee can take on as well. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the comments. And thank you, General Maxwell. Really appreciate your taking the time to be with us and clarifying the board's action and establishing the partnership that I know we have with the board, and your support is much appreciated.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. And again, thank you all for your service on this. I think you've heard it's going to get busier before it doesn't. There's going to still be a lot of work to be done, and do know that the board wants to support you and the TMC in getting to what's going to be the best plan for us all. So thanks again for all your time and effort.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to item number 5, which is going to be a short, famous last words, short update on the Technical Management Committee's activities over the past month or so. We're going to, I think, let Rick provide us with some high-level background, and then I see that John Bernal is with us. I don't know if Terry Rosema is also, but if either of those gentlemen wants to weigh in after we hear from Rick, then they're most welcome to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's good to see everybody again. Hope you're all doing well. First and foremost, just because I've heard everybody struggle with it, can you hear me okay? Is this working all right? Clear enough? And everybody online as well? I just seen a thumbs up. I'll take it. A couple things I want to clarify that General Maxwell talked about with regards to the 2 projects going on. I wanted to expand on a little bit of what he mentioned that the board had acted on with regards to Silver Bell and to First Avenue. For Silver Bell, the actual project that they referred to is what we're referring to as the 3rd phase. There's one piece that's been made. The whole project goes from Grant all the way up to Ina Road. That's how it's listed on the RTA current plan. However, the first section from Grant to Goray, built by the city of Tucson, I think was completed back in around 2017. The second section right now, the design's been finalized. The utility relocation is going on. This is basically going to go from Goray to Camino del Cerro. So it continues the 4-lane widening. The piece that the RTA board took action on is what we're referred to as phase 3, goes from basically Goray, Del Cerro, all the way up to Ina. So it's the last piece, if you will. That still may be further divided as the lead jurisdictions decide how they want to move forward to it. But it's not the Silver Bell project in its entirety. There's still going to be a portion coming forward, moving forward with construction, anticipated to start later this year, very first part of next year. So wanted to clarify that. With regards to the point you brought up on First Avenue, it's not a total elimination of the project. When the RTA task force looked at this under the TMC's purview, they actually looked at, and the county had proposed, a reduced scope. And as Farhad and General Maxwell talked about, it's the crossing, the lane configuration. What do we need to move the vehicles through there? We can look at a certain number of measurements and tools on that and say, is that going to still provide the function that it needs to? It does. The TMC members and the task force looked at it and said there's still a need to have the pedestrian and bicycle and transit components in there. So we don't want to eliminate and say that the roadway we've got is adequate. What we said, or what the group said in their proposal, is they can be scaled back, reconfigured. We need to still have those amenities added in there so you still have a fully functional roadway. So that's what in turn, there is a change to the lane configuration, but the other functional amenities that give you your multimodal capabilities will be moving forward. So I want to make sure that that was hopefully I could add a little bit of extra clarification on that. One of the key things that I did want to update you on is one of the efforts that came out of and was a result from our previous CAC meeting was what's the jurisdiction's priorities. So in working with the team and the staff here at the RTA, what we did is we initiated an exercise with them. We presented it and gave them a quick overview at one of their earlier meetings in May, and then followed that up with a letter saying, we're asking you now as TMC members, all TMC, the private plus the public, okay? You give us your ranking using everything you know, the project knowledge you have, what you submitted, the regional benefits. Please be aware of the goals and the guiding principles that have been developed already, and start ranking. You tell us what you think, 1 through 108. And then we'll have a way of being able to use that information, modify it, evaluate it, package it in different ways as we evaluate what that all means and translates into. And we'll be bringing that forward as we progress through the rest of the summer. We asked for that information by the end of June, so the TMC members will all be coming back on that. So right now, we've only gotten preliminary inquiries onto how we navigate the tool, exactly how are we looking this. So we're very early on. This only went out about a week ago, but we expect as the month of June progresses and the TMC members are able to work on that, then we'll be able to bring back a lot more information to answer that. Well, what does the jurisdiction think the priority is? What do the TMC members feel the priorities are? Well, that's a different question. So we can make sure we address that on all levels. So those are the two big activities that I wanted to make you guys aware of. Tom, I'll let either Terry or John jump in if they got anything else they want to cover on that.
Mr. Chairman, this is John Bernal.
Go ahead, John. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Rick pretty much covered, the task that has been assigned to the Technical Management Committee. And, we've got a deadline of the end of this month, in fact, to provide our initial listing of project priorities. So that's what the TMC will be busy working on in the next few weeks.
Terrific. Thank you. We do have a question here in the room. Abby?
Thank you, Rick. That was very enlightening. Can people online hear me?
I think you should try to get a little bit closer.
Okay, we'll try this one. Ooh, thank you. That was super helpful. I'm still a little bit confused about what the TMC is. And so my question about what you're saying about the ranking, are each of the submitting jurisdictions ranking their own projects and then the TMC is also ranking them? How does that gonna work?
So the TMC is made up of the member jurisdiction. So you're gonna have a representative, typically a director or a manager at a very high level of that. There's also then, I think we have 6 private sector members. They don't represent a jurisdiction. All members have been asked to rank all projects. Don't just rank yours. Rank all 108. Now, it's possible they may look at it and go, well, I think mine are the top ones, until they see the whole package of it and go, actually, some of the ones covered by another jurisdiction would actually rank higher than mine. So they're going to rank all 108. And so we'll get, I think, 18 or 16 different responses back of where all 108 sit. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, my question, I have concerns about that. If the TMC are representatives from the jurisdictions, but not necessarily the people who submitted the project, so I'm going to just pick on Marana because it's easy to pronounce. Let's say that Marana had somebody submit a project, but the TMC person from Marana isn't the people who submitted. What if Marana doesn't care that much about that project anymore?
So no, what would happen is we've gone to the TMC member who was also responsible for the original submittal of the projects.
Okay.
So the 108 projects that came were response to this committee asking for, we want to know from the TMC. And so each jurisdictional representative, they're the ones that get the assignment in the first place. Hey, what projects would you submit? They're the ones that are going to get this assignment. Well, take it one step further and rank them for us.
Okay, and can that be incorporated with like the weighted tool that Ava was suggesting? Or are these just give us your priorities, not necessarily based on?
I think it's too early to tell because we'd have to see what comes back on it and kind of knowing what Ava's going for. There's probably some assimilation that would have to be thought through, but right now it'd be just too hard for me to kind of guess what that would be. I think it'll be a tool that will help this committee then say, okay, what did surface to the top? Hey, if 8 jurisdictions and 5 private individuals ranked these top 10 projects and they were all pretty similar, that would be good information for you to know. Yeah. Vice versa, wow, these fell out at the bottom. Everybody agreed. This is number 105, 106, 107, 108. That's good to know as well.
So it's fair to say this is like the initial skimming?
This is a very initial skim, yeah.
Okay.
One of the key things that I'm going to leave you, and I'm going to emphasize this through all my presentation stuff, is this is iterative. This is not, you're writing this in ink, put it down, you'll never touch it again. This is meant to be jello, squish, play paint. Whatever cliche sticks with you, you're going to work this one. You're going to mold this, you're going to create it. You may take parts off, you may put stuff back on. But think of the days of playing with Play-Doh, because that's what a lot of this is like, is you're now just trying to really shape stuff up, see what comes and holds up, but it's not a one crack only type of thing. It's not a one revisitation.
Bruce.
Thanks for that. It was really helpful. First of all, I spent this morning, believe it or not, 3 hours going through all 108 projects. One of the data points that's missing is it doesn't list the jurisdiction that offers. At least I couldn't find it. If it does, I'll look again. But that was very helpful because it's much easier to read what you've given us than the previous documents that we had. As to the rankings, is it also possible for you to give us the projects by jurisdiction so that we see which projects fall as a grouping and the total dollar amount for each of those jurisdictions and what percentage of their ask is of the total? Because I think that would help us give us a perspective about where the demand is based upon the jurisdictional perception.
My presentation today won't go into that quite that level of detail, but yes, we'd be able to sort it that way coming forward with once they finish out the ranking or prioritization. We would be able to have that access to that data.
Bruce brings up a point that will absolutely be of more interest to us as we go forward. Okay, last question on this item before Rick dives into the projects. Brian.
Point of clarification. So the RTA is made up of elected officials from each jurisdiction, correct?
The
The RTA board?
RTA board,
Yes, the RTA board is made up of elected officials, and the TMC is made up of staff members from each of those jurisdictions as well, right? As you stated, usually either directors or managers from either traffic or from the town. So we have representation from both the elected officials from each jurisdiction, as well as the staff members who are the ones who have to carry out these projects once they're done. And it is our job as the committee to report back through each of those based on their guidance, correct?
Yeah, we're not directly receiving information about the priorities from the electeds. These are from staff and all interested parties within the jurisdiction coming together to declare their needs and to prioritize those things. Obviously, at some level, board members will have some interest, but so will their compatriots on those governing boards within the jurisdiction. So as an example, the city of Tucson, Mayor Romero is the member of the RTA board, but other members of her city council will certainly have their own thoughts and ideas about projects and prioritization and even our guiding principles for that matter.
Very good.
So-
But my point to clarify was we have a good representation of elected officials, appointed staff members, as well as us, the citizens from around the region to help drive this project collectively.
Right, and obviously the next level is the general public and the voters kind of as a group, which.
Can I make a comment here? I think, it's 108 projects is extraordinarily difficult to go through and to make each decision on what are the other ones. I would, in my experience, there are ways to not look at the good, look at the ones you can dismiss quickly. And I would look at the priorities from the jurisdictions very, very carefully and look at what their lowest priorities are. And if we can reach an agreement that some of those are very, very low, they're never going to be very, very high, then let's dismiss them and get the actual really important projects to them in the table so that we can spend the time looking at the ones that are most important to the jurisdictions.
Good comment. Thank you. Farhad.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to add that, as you mentioned earlier, that's part of the homework that we were talking about, that once we have the feedback from TMC, we'll provide those reports to you and the ranking. This way, you'll have all that information so you can look at it any which way you like. And that's consistent to what Tom was just saying, that you'll have everybody's ranking and how they view the priorities and then the breakdown. So that's the homework that we were hoping that we can send to you as soon as we have all that information. So please keep a lookout for an email with that additional information. And hopefully that's the beginning of the process for this committee to start looking at that information.
Right, and that homework begins now, actually, as Rick presents to us some of the information that he's compiled from these jurisdictional submittals in our item number 6.
Okay, fantastic. It's probably been a long time coming, and I'm going to give you a bunch of disclaimers as we go along. First and foremost, I've really tried to make sure I pay attention, listen to the dialogue, the discussion, the concerns and questions. As I go along, if there are questions, clarifications, something doesn't make sense, jump in, wave, interrupt, that's not a problem. If you could save the discussion till I get through the whole presentation, but if there's clarifying type of things that, hey, that phrase, wait a sec, I thought it meant something different, by all means, I'll try to expand on that, clarify it, make sure we don't roll anybody over. Number two, Ted Maxwell mentioned, number one, this is learning. In 45 minutes when this ends, you're not gonna be sitting there going, wow, okay, great, now I can pick my top 30. This is meant to introduce them. This is here to show it to you. This is to whet your appetite and then whet it some more. So this is meant to be, how do the wheels get going? What do I like? What sounds good? What do I need to know more about? Whoever it was that mentioned it, I thought it was a great suggestion. Field trips are a brilliant review. I will tell you from an engineering perspective, Google Earth has saved my bacon. That is a great tool. Don't underestimate the ability of the internet in that regard. It doesn't tell you what's happening at 7:05 in the morning. I'll give you that. But it tells you what you're gonna see out there and go, does there have sidewalk? Where do the residences lie? Oh, wait a second, there's a building being built right there. Good to know. So it'll tell you presence of things. And that's a really, really useful, effective tool that you can take advantage of when you're sitting at a desk. So I'm gonna go through this here. Let's see, make sure I've got control okay. All right. So several things I wanted to kind of hit upon before I go in depth on the project stuff, but I wanted to kind of paint some overview, share some information, give you perspective on this as we're going forward on it. First and foremost, the current plan consists of 4 elements on this, okay? So we've got the roadway, safety, environmental and economic vitality, and transit. Think of that as the 4 big buckets, 4 big groups. We refer to them formally as elements. So you'll hear me use that phrase going forward, and I'll try to make sure I'm very, very good about sticking with that particular phrase on that. But those are the 4 that the current plan embodies on that. The final elements for RTA Next are going to be reviewed and approved by the board with input coming from all of you. So you've heard discussion. General Maxwell already talked about maintenance is in their purview. That's a tough one. You want to start a fight in a bar, go in and say, what should maintenance be? That's a toughie. Technology is another good one. That's a really, really good topic, but what does it mean? How do we incorporate it? What do we do about it? Still to be determined, think about it going forward. Are there others we've missed about? So it's not finalized on it, but we wanted a starting point. And today's plan works very well in covering all those broad categories. So that's why we're starting with that. The CAC had agreed to start on that as our basic starting point on that. And obviously then recommendations can come forward on that. The board had requested a list of projects when several years ago, as this effort got underway, they had tasked the jurisdictions. You will get a list of projects in for the CAC consideration on that. Those were some of the key deadlines that came upon. So the board wanted to start that effort with us. Now I'll talk a little bit more about this. Why start with roadway projects? Why can't we start with the others? Why can't we start? We can. However, the roadway projects are traditionally the biggest investment. If you look at the current plan, if you look at past bond packages, they represent the bigger investment. They're also more complicated because there's a lot more involved in the specificity of them. There also is a lot more to juggle around. Trying to move 10, 20, $30 million roadway projects and when it's going to happen in the plan and how it lines up with everything else is an art and a science. So there's a lot of complications to it. Start with the bigger one. Get the bigger category or the bigger element figured out, then come back and be able to see how the others interact with it. It doesn't mean you wrote it in ink, put it down, can't touch it again. It means take a stab, start at it, see what it generates. Where does it give us? Now how do the rest of the pieces all fit in around that? If you ever hear that big rocks analogy, it's the big rocks you're working on. Now what do we put in the rest of the pieces, the sand, the gravel, and the water? So that's why that one's been chosen to. It's not prioritizing it over anything else. It's saying that's the more complicated one to get started with. And then the other elements, sub-elements, those are going to be refined and added as we talk about with it. So let's see. Okay, following the adoption guiding principles, CAC requested TMC members. Okay, so this was one of the key things come back with and said, all right, we want you now to submit your candidate projects for us. So all the jurisdictions then came back and said, this is what we think we would want to submit for your consideration that would meet up with your goals and your criteria and that are on our hot list. There are projects we need. So they didn't just manufacture them, they're ones they've thought about. And they had a variety of input sources for them. Some folks did surveys on their own, others have got a laundry list from their long range plan. So all of it came about from different places. And that's good. That's what we want. How did you generate that to bring it forward and share it for consideration on that? As you've heard pounded into you by now a million times over, you're staring at 108 of them across a wide spectrum of needs. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. You've got everything from the brand new virgin alignment, big roadway reconstructions, down to some small, simple bike and pedestrian enhancements. So everything that's been submitted does cover a very, very broad range of transportation. So how do we refine that? We'll talk more about that as we go forward. The total on this represents 4.6 billion bucks, which is a lot, which all that is meant to do is say, relative to the 2 billion, give or take, that we expect to bring in, our needs far outweigh our capability. That's good. Now, there's been a question of, well, how can we review these projects if the cost estimates in a hypersensitive world right now, we know they're going to be off? And that's a true statement. We don't have all the specific details. What we do is we refer to this as planning level information. We have planning level cost. We also have planning level scope, meaning we've roughly defined this. I don't know all the exact details. We haven't worked with the jurisdiction to pinpoint exacts, and that's okay. At this point in time, while you're considering it, it's meant to be conceptual. It paints a picture of what you look at. It's going to be ABC length, point A to point B. It's going to have this many lanes. It'll have pedestrian facilities. I don't know whether that's sidewalk and multi-use path, 2 sidewalks and a multi-use. We don't have to worry about that now. All we have to know is that it's fully functional. It's going to address things, and we'll make sure we've got a price tag associated with it. It'll be refined as we go forward. Tom.
Rick, just to clarify, this also speaks to the question about inflation. There's been a huge amount of inflation over the past 2 years when these original estimates were prepared. Those estimates have not all been kind of done by the same party. They've been done by the individual jurisdictions. So we're not dealing with actual dollar amounts at this point. But relatively speaking, we have a ballpark.
We have a ballpark, and that's a good way of looking at it. So as we go forward, I'm going to hit that and I'll hit it. One of the things that we will be working with TMC on, though, is once we get to a more manageable list, once you've refined this down to a workable list, then we'll send a detailed technical team and evaluation through and go, we're going to chase now the answers. We're going after the specifics of this. We're going to find out A plus, or A point A to point B. It's actually B plus an extra 1,000 feet. And we're going to include a couple extra things on there. We're going to make sure that those parameters, factors, and elements are all thought about so that we can accompany it with a nice price tag on it. So it may refine up a little bit. It may refine down a little bit. But what we'll do is tighten that up. We didn't want to do that on all 108. The jurisdictions knew the projects well enough to say, here's a good ballpark. It's not off by a huge factor, but we know there's still some squish with you. You're going to have input you're going to offer in. TMC is going to have input. Don't fine tune it until we get that narrowed down a bit. Go ahead.
$4.6 billion is the total cost of state federal money. Matching funds for these projects, for instance, on the Interstate 10 improvements. Is that correct?
So that's correct. So and think of it this way, 4.6 billion is what it'll cost. Somebody's got to cover that. Right now, we know we're anticipating about 2-ish to be able to available through our TA revenue. If there's more, now these are going to be discussions going forward. What other supplemental revenue will be brought to the table? What others will the feds, the states, the locals be able to add to supplement that? So we know cost and we know funding. Funding's coming up. Right now, cost is higher than funding. In a perfect world, if somebody said, I got 2.6 sitting around, project solved, problem there, build them all. We know that's not the case, but does that answer your question?
It does. Will the TMC, though, try to give us the potential other sources of funding that could be supporting that project? Because we need to understand what the mix of funding is going to be so that we can set the priorities.
Those will be coming up as well. So we expect that will unfold as the refined list go forward. So there may be some that they're looking at going, we're sitting on 25 million of our own in a particular source, but if that project doesn't ferret out, doesn't prioritize out, okay, no sense bringing that to the table because it may be specific to a particular, like a developer project. Others, nope, we can still contribute to that, and now we're ready to engage with, here's the supplemental sources we can bring to the table. So still have those conversations down the line. Yeah, we don't need to know it now, and that's okay, because all we really have to focus on are the two elements that are under your purview. What's the overall plan going to cost, and what's within the RTA expected revenue? We'll add the others as we come along. Okay. One thing I mentioned a minute. Let's see, I'm already ahead of myself. So that gets to got a billion things between all these that I wanted to make sure I covered on this. One thing that came up last month, you heard General Maxwell talk about it a minute ago. Right now, they're assuming the current half-cent rate. That's what's been planned on. Several folks are aware that state legislation had passed, which allowed it to go up to a full cent. And that's good to know. But that decision hasn't been made yet. RTA efforts, our RMAP efforts you've heard referred to, we're planning or assuming the half-cent continues forward. That's a starting point. It makes sense. You can look at that and say, that's today. Okay, that's a good starting point. That'll be a dialogue as well with the board. Hey, if we come in and say, you know, there's some really compelling argument to a higher level investment, the supplemental sources aren't really there, there's discussion that can be happening at the board level for, hey, do we want to adjust that rate a little bit? Now it's back to what other situations are going on around the community? Where's the recession to come into play? Where are the other taxes that have been passed locally? How do they come into play? All things that would be discussed at that point in time. But for right now, the amounts you see, that's all been said. Let's assume we keep going with what we've got. That's a good starting point, but we know those other pieces will be in the mix later on as we go forward. So that's that iterative discussion. It goes back and forth. It's going to be a lot of, we think this, what's the feedback on it? Love it, keep going, tweak it, change it. We'll have to play out, see how it goes. Let's see. Okay. All right, so as this goes forward, the mission of the CAC, you heard this talked about. Pocky gave a great presentation on all aspect of it. It's for all of you. This is the part where, hey, what do you think? What do you feel? What do you see? What do you know? What do your residents, what do your neighbors, friends, family members, what do they all come in with? What do they think is going to be a wise investment? What do we think is going to make a difference here in the community? Well, would we all support and be on board with? So that's your effort, is to take all this stuff and go, here's a great plan that makes sense going forward on this. At that point in time, then once we get the proposed projects, that's where the feedback dialogue will be on those specifics. That's the really good part about this approach. Is it the only? No, there's a lot of ways of doing this, but this is the one we know is going to work the best. We've had great success with it on the past way as well. That we'll take specifics out and see what the comments, the feedback, the specific things that you would want to hear about from the public, the residents, the citizens that are going to utilize the roadway system. So that's why there's an aspect of that it's not quite a chicken and egg, as there's much more of a cause and effect. Let's see, I already hit upon the draft iterative. The last thing that I really want to emphasize, and you're seeing it now, is you've got staff that's going to have an active role in this. TMC is a partner in it, CAC and board. So there's a lot of interaction, iteration, and a lot of dialogue that's going to go back and forth on this. So now everybody's in the pool. Everybody's got roles. You summarized it very well. So everybody's going to have a role and a participation in all this stuff in there so that it's not done on an island, not done by yourselves.
Rick, just.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, Arlen, go ahead.
Staff. Use it. I heard staff use the term.
She said staff.
Staff.
Thank you. Going, oh no, another acronym.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say. Did I say
Either
staff?
that or
Right,
he
yeah.
was, or he
what did
was
I read,
referring
though?
to me. I think he may have been referring to me.
I'm sure not.
Yeah, I was gonna say, thanks a lot, man. You threw me under the bus on that one. Okay, so to assist you with your review and discussion of these projects as we go forward, what we did is we broke them into 5 big major categories, if you will. Okay, so this is kind of trying to identify them based on the functional thinking of how we look at these. One thing I'll qualify this, these are working phrases. Okay, so if you were to Google this, go ask transportation professionals, you'll probably get a little subjectivity. It's not a biblical definition, but they're common working phrases that if you went into a city public meeting, you go into an Oro Valley public meeting, you go talk to transportation professionals and so on, they would generally say and refer to these things in these phrases and these terminologies. So we're trying to stay consistent with the profession across all levels, with you as CAC members, all the way into the TMC realm, so that they would know, oh, that's what we mean. That's what we talk about. That's what we say as well. So the 5 that we've identified are capacity enhancements, and I'll go through each of these because I'm going to go through in detail on this. Functionalization. Sometimes you hear it called modernization. They're the same thing. Okay. We prefer to stick with functionalization because one of the board pledges in the current RTA plan was we will never diminish functionality. That's a real phrase in there. Modernization's got a little squishiness to it, but functionalization has carried forward throughout the current plan. We want to make sure that continues forward into this one. And it's a little more broad-based than maybe multimodal because it deals with, freight corridors, all modes that you can travel by, general operations. So it's a little bit more broad-based and all-encompassing. So that's why you hear us pick on that one. Operational, that's fairly self-explanatory. New roadway connections. And then lastly, transit capital improvements, not operations. Okay, operations is where you're getting into the nuts and bolts of the service times, the hours and all that stuff. This is the actual capital side, the product that's going to go on the street side. All right, so evaluating projects this early on, it is subjective. All right, we all know that. This is meant to be, it doesn't have a run down the checklist, find that, line it up across thing. There's a degree of subjectivity. There's supposed to be, we're early on, we're massaging this. We want to see how this is all going to come together on this. So understand that, be ready for it, accept that. The groups are broad. The goals that you're going to hear me talk about, they're all encompassing. They're very loosely defined or they're open to interpretations, and that's okay at this early point. And maybe something as Tom leads you through efforts going forward, I'll talk about this more at the tail end. There may be a desire to tighten that up, or maybe, you know what, we want a broader way of looking at this so that we can capture and include more of the projects in those particular areas. One thing to also note, each jurisdiction did do the goal evaluation. Okay, they went through and they took the goals that had been identified by this committee and said, well, how does my project line up on that? Good to know. How did you see that as a jurisdictional representative? Then we as staff kind of said, let's be a little bit more consistent in looking at it from a set of lenses across all of them, and what would be our extra addition, refinement, change, modification. So we tried to add a level of consistency on that as well. So it's had several sets of eyes looking at it. So when you see something on there, recognize we'll have some criteria, we'll have some thinking, some logic and rationale that'll either line up real well with how the jurisdiction did it, or they may look at it and go, well, we didn't want to take credit for it, but if you do, that's great. It's not meant to be a either. It's, hey, let's have the discussion of how well it matches up. That's all it aids for. As I've mentioned, as you're hearing, I apologize for sounding like a broken record on it. We don't have every detail on that. That's still to come. We don't want to chase the details out for 108 projects when we know realistically maybe 30 to 40, because it's going to be a lot of work. Literally, we're going to start laying things out and going, where would this roadway go? How would it look? Do we want to move it to one side or the other? Do we have major environmental considerations we have to deal with? We've got a lot of factors that are going to take from general concept level to we can give you something to work with. We just don't want to do it on projects that wouldn't survive the consideration of that. So you're not seeing a lot of specificity, but that's okay. That doesn't mean it's not going to come, or that doesn't mean it can't be suggested. Saying, we really do believe there should be something added to this that can all still come, evaluate, and be added to it as we go along. Tom?
Rick, as you prepare to dive into these categories, I have a couple of questions. I'm not sure we want to take the time to have those questions, excuse me, answered, but I would like to at least let the two folks online who have those announce what those questions are. We'll see whether they get answered or have been answered, or if they're something for a future meeting.
Go for it. So
I'll start with Carolyn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks, Rick. That was super helpful. I have one clarification and one request, if possible. And the clarification is that the named corridor projects weren't requested by the CAC. They were requested of the jurisdictions by the staff. So I just wanted to let people know that. And then the second one is it was brought up that we could get the jurisdictions that submitted the projects, in future iterations. And I was wondering if you could mention, I assume you know at least most of them as you go through them. So could you just mention which jurisdiction submitted the projects as you go through each project, if you know who they are?
I can. I was not intending to go through each individual one since I know we've kind of done that before. But if there are questions specific to, hey, which one does this lie in? We're a little confused on it. I could certainly expand on that.
Okay, gotcha. I'll just let that, leave that to individuals if they have questions. Thank you.
You got it. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Carolyn. And just to clarify, those projects were submitted as a result of a memo from me representing the CAC to each of the jurisdictions back in 2019, asking for them to submit by June 30th of 2020. Okay, next question is.
Mr. Chair, if I may clarify even further.
Sure, go ahead, Farhad.
That was at the request of the RTA board. The board established the deadline and requested for everyone to submit their projects. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Patricia.
Thanks, Farhad.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Just one quick question, and I apologize if I missed this. And thank you for this presentation. It's, yeah, again, super helpful. But so it's my understanding that the CAC is kind of whittling this list, as you've described, of conceptual projects without that background information of like funding and specifics of how the project would actually work, or like data backing the choices. If that's the case, which I understand, do we have a number of projects or like a budget number that we're shooting for that does constitute that workable list that'll go to the TMC? Like, is there something specific that we're whittling towards?
The way I would answer that is right now, I'd say target more than specific. So we're envisioning roughly $2 billion to be available for the whole plan. So that's a starting point. That's less than half of the cost that we have right now allocated for it. As you heard General Maxwell talk, the board has not identified their bucket ranges of what they may see the individual element contributions being. Plus, we don't know exactly what other supplemental funding would come into available. So I wish I could give you a tighter window. I know that doesn't narrow it very well, but that probably would whack it by at least half. Does that help, Patricia?
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll probably continue discussing that.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a starting point. So we'll see how it comes together. You may find that as you adopt a certain set of criteria, viewpoints, perspectives on that, you may be able to apply a certain screening on it and take it down to $1 billion or $1.5 billion and say, ooh, did we go too far? Do we want to leave ourselves with a little capability to grow? You'll have those discussions going forward on it. Right now, I think we're telling in our ask to TMC, it was roughly about the $2 billion range. And that's commensurate with what we expect the revenue to come in at.
Okay.
One thing I wanted to really, I mentioned it, Tom mentioned it. Oh, geez, I'm sorry. Did I miss?
Yeah.
Oh, my bad. I apologize.
I was looking at your definitions of, capacity enhancements and functionalization, operational, new roadway connections, and transit capital improvements. I understand most of those.
Yep.
But there's something new that's coming up as from the city of Tucson. That is the complete streets projects. When you look at a lot of these projects, I don't see where they fit in here. Is there a particular place they fit, or are they a combination of things, or, because they're typically, many of them aren't capacity, and they're not new roadway connections. They're not, transit capital, where would those things, where they're, well, for instance, I take their project that they're talking about on, from Alvernon to Wilmot on Speedway.
Right.
Okay. It's about curbs and sidewalks and bike lanes, etc. Does that fit into this? Is there another category we should be thinking about those kind of projects in, or?
So the way I try to look at it with regards to complete streets is think of it as that's the other companion definition, or that's a similar definition to a fully functional roadway. If you say you have a complete street, you have a fully functional roadway, you're saying the same thing. Are all modes that are using that system being accommodated? The answer is yes. Okay, both check boxes. Have we got all the amenities out there that we would expect the transportation system to provide? Yes, check boxes on that. We haven't short-sighted anybody. We haven't left something hanging. We aren't failing to meet a need on that. So a complete street isn't really, in our definition, isn't a category as much as it is a way of describing and saying, is it complete in all the functions that it's providing, in all the ways it's meeting the demands and needs?
So what you're saying is it basically would fall into the functionalization?
It generally resembles that more closely, but all 5 categories have the ability to be complete streets.
Yeah.
Capacity will be a complete street when it's built out. A new roadway, as long as it meets all the needs and functional definitions on it, it's going to be a complete street. So it's a way of describing, like I said, I like the phrase fully functional. The city has chosen to use complete streets, but they're one and the same, meaning we're not favoring one over another or omitting something, first of all. Does that get to your question?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Definitions. So Tom talked about this in the beginning, and I'll hit upon this now. Some key things that I'll leave with you here as we look forward. Plan elements. So those are the 4 main broad categories: roadway, safety, environmental and economic vitality, and transit improvements. Current plan, but when we talk about the big 4 groupings, categories, elements is the definition of them, okay? Sub-elements, those are going to be the various sub-items underneath each one. And so we've got 48 items in the current plan altogether. So you have intersections, bikeways, greenways, pathways, pedestrian ways. Okay, those are the sub-elements that allow for those refinements or more detailed categories. Oftentimes, you've heard us refer to them as categoricals. We'll try to make sure we refer to them as sub-elements a lot more. Yeah, it's a jargon. We said, well, it's a category versus a named project. We'll really try to make sure we do a good job of elements versus sub-elements on that. I'll hopefully break that in better. To the point you're talking about, functionality. This is your president's effective configuration. This is your basic layout. Going back to, are all roadway needs, I should say roadway, transportation needs being addressed? Freight corridors, all modes of aspect. And you notice I put equestrian up there. Yes, some roadway corridors overlap with paths and trails designations and need to have that acknowledged transportation mode built into its system to make sure it's a fully effective, fully functional roadway system. But it also goes above and beyond. Is it drainage? Is it all weather? Does it block out during monsoon season or during a heavy winter storm? That it's not fully functioning as you intended it to be. It's broken in a way or it's missing something. Those are all words that you can think of to describe on that. Corridors. These could be multimodal, they could be transit, bike ped corridors on there. The key thing I want you all to be thinking about, we've heard this talked about, I talked about this maybe 2 or 3 years ago in one of the original introductions, but it bears repeating out here now. Regional corridors. Okay, we're using the key word is regional. Spans multiple jurisdictions. Okay, so if you're going cross jurisdictional boundaries, then it falls better in that definition of a regional corridor. Wanted to make sure we had a companion one because there's of regional significance. Those are the ones that may be in one jurisdiction only, but they connect sub-regions, key points of employment, destination, recreation. They connect them very well, span several miles, even though they may be entirely, or the main functioning part of it is within one jurisdiction. We didn't want to lose sight and just call that local because it's providing a necessary benefit to the overall sub-region on that. And then local is a more obvious explanation. Those are your local shorter connections that really just get folks around from one little small pot to another. Okay. Region mobility versus crosstown. This is gray. I will give you that. This one's kind of tough to pin down. Don't die on this hill of trying to figure out what is that definition? Is it 7.2395 miles or yeah? This one have a little subjectivity and have a lot of patience with, but it connects your major employment centers, your residential areas, your recreational areas. It's connecting across the region. So if you're going from one major part of the region to another, that's what you can think of as regional connectivity or regional mobility. Some of those examples are going to be like Houghton, Tangerine, Grant Road, Speedway, Valencia, Silverbell, Sahuarita Road. You're getting major connections from one point to another, and you're connecting those sub areas and with the other jurisdictions, municipalities, and other areas as well. So that's kind of the way to think about some of those key definitions, and I'll try to make sure we use those definitions going forward.
This brings a question.
Go for it.
In these 108 projects, a good number of the projects we've had before, just as you mentioned, Tangerine, Grant Road, et cetera, they cross jurisdictions.
Yes.
In these 108 projects, have you merged jurisdictional to one project, or might we find the piece of that project in more locations in the 108? You understand what I mean?
No, admittedly, you kind of lost me.
All
Say it
right,
again.
let's take a road, for instance, like Tangerine.
Okay.
It's the county, Marana, and Oro Valley,
Okay.
let's say, okay? When Oro Valley was looking at a project, and that project is in there, is that an individual 108 project, or did you merge the three of those to be the Tangerine project?
We have not done any merging.
So there will be projects that are in there that are repeated by a different jurisdiction.
Repeated, or so the task that was given to the individual jurisdictions through the TMC on that is identify within their jurisdiction. You will see, and I will highlight a couple examples in here, where one jurisdiction picked up to their boundaries, point A to point B, and the next one came up and said, well, I'm going from point A to point C.
All right. Yeah.
So they have the ability, as you go through and evaluate, going, you know what, that might be a better single corridor project rather than three individual or two individual pieces.
Yes.
There may be benefit to, we'll create a full corridor from point A to point C.
Yeah, well, it also goes to enhance our need for these jurisdictional priorities, because we will see some of that there.
Yes, you will see some of that. So the individual ones, there will be opportunities for that. If you got questions, I can expand on that as well. Okay. All right, so definitions, now the fun stuff. Okay, so this is getting into the 5 categories. Now this is a little bit more of the meat behind all this stuff. So the capacity enhancements, okay, these are your larger projects. They reconstruct the entire roadway. They're intending to provide the multimodal capacity, improve safety, reduce congestion, and improve mobility. Okay, why I say these are reconstruction. Oftentimes they get labeled. You may hear about, oh, it's a 4-lane widening. Oftentimes that creates a picture in everybody's mind. I'm bolting on a second set of lanes. No, I'm ripping this thing up and I'm putting it back down. That's 99% of the time. On rare occasion, can you just add the second set? A lot of times you're dealing with drainage that didn't quite meet everything properly. The roadway bed was designed 30, 40 years ago. The traffic volume is way overweigh that. Now we've got to build that up so it's stronger and more functionally effective. Sometimes we have to shift the alignment on there so that we avoid sensitive key areas. So that's why I use the phrase reconstruct. So that's a key thing in here. The key differentiation on this is capacity. The existing ability for the roadway, the lane configuration is inadequate. You're overloaded. I've got too many cars, too many people, too many XYZ using what I've got, and it needs to be bigger. So I'm just gonna have to read off of mine. I apologize for this. So out of the 108 projects we got, 47 came in as capacity, following that definition, approximately $2 billion. Okay, so I give you an idea right there on the price tag on that. Yes, it does leave you kind of shocked. Now, one thing to note, and I'll hit upon this in a couple of them, or they stick out. There are, I believe, 18 projects associated with ADOT's I-10-210 effort. Okay, that hovers around $1 billion on that. Even though ADOT has identified 18 phased pieces for that, it's all part of the overall enhancement to those 2 big major corridors. So think about it that way. They're not a standalone, get done, walk away. Hey, I don't have to touch that one again. No, there's 17 others that are all meant to tie together on that. So it's a very, very specific set of building blocks on that. Yeah.
I was looking at those ADOT. I did the same thing Bruce did. I've gone through about 2 or 3 hours to this.
You guys did your homework. Good job.
But when you look at those ADOT projects, my recollection is that their original submission included projects beyond Kolb Road, and this seems to just go to Kolb Road. Am I confused that there wasn't anything beyond Kolb Road before? Or
their original effort from several years ago went all the way out to Houghton. They revised that project limit to stop at the Kolb Road area.
Okay.
So they were able to say, ooh, based on our growth projections, expected needs on that, Kolb is now our new eastern terminus.
So it has changed to just Kolb Road.
Several years ago, but they've stuck with that for the last probably 3 or 4, if not more.
Okay.
So the key thing on this was an exercise we wanted to bring to the table. Tom talked about in the beginning. So this was an extra refinement, an extra value added effort that we want to take a stab on, which is how do they line up with your goals? So you've got goals you've identified. We've got things we know we want to achieve out of this. outcomes, if you will, that we want the system to perform and these projects to compare against. So what we wanted to do was kind of take a stab. As I mentioned, the jurisdictions did it. They submitted, they're the project owner. They went through and they said, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. Now, within the broadness of these categories, this is why I have one disclaimer on this. We're using the phrase generally or it depends because there's a very, very wide range of some of these projects and how they line up on this. So I'll give you some examples. Reduce congestion. Generally, a capacity job is going to reduce congestion. However, one of the key things is the roadway at congestion levels now. I had mentioned in the beginning that when a jurisdiction looks at it, generally it's because the road's broken, it's overloaded, but there were a couple examples where, you know what, it's not quite there yet. Could be under certain growth situations, that's why it was included, but it's not there yet. So we didn't want to make that an unequivocal, yes, it does it all the time. Same thing on efficient crosstown mobility. There's several of these that are on smaller areas concentrated in the subregions. So does it meet that definition of crosstown? Well, that's a little bit subjective to it. Some of them you'll look at and you'll go, that's really only a couple miles across one particular segment. So I don't know if that meets our kind of regional perspective of crosstown. So those will be things you'll want to look at. But as a general rule of thumb, for the most part, they do get crosstown. Transit ridership depends. Well, why does it depend? If there's bus routes now, are there going to be bus facilities afterwards? If there's not routes that use it now, then how are you improving transit ridership? Sometimes that's a chicken and egg. What I found is a big corridor gets enhanced, roadway gets reconnected, new alignments, then the transit comes along because it identifies, hey, we can expand our routes and service those areas. Other times, no, we don't have that on our long range plan just yet. So what people would normally think of is, yes, you're always going to have better situation for transit. It depends on kind of where the service routes match up that to go with it. If there is transit facilities, yes, you'll see bus stops, pullouts, all the proper usage of those amenities that are necessary to ensure it functions properly. Reduce crashes at intersections. Generally, yes. If you're ripping up the roadway, you're going to make the intersection better unless it's already pretty good. It may not be a significant high accident location. Hard to believe, but there have been times where the intersection, it functions pretty good. It's not working too badly. Yes, we'll still improve it. Yes, we'll maximize the safety with all the best features we can add to that. But in order for it to say, well, it's reducing crashes, well, its crash history is not particularly problematic. Now, that's not always the case. Oftentimes on an overloaded facility, there's nightmare intersections. There's a reason the whole corridor is not working real well. Don't worry, we're going to get those fixed too. Wildlife-related crashes. It depends because it depends. Is this roadway intersecting an environmentally sensitive area? Sometimes these are going through dense urban areas. There's not a wildlife interface there. We're not going to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions if there's no wildlife to collide. Likewise, there are some of these that are going through have very, very sensitive trigger areas. So we'd want to make sure that the proper amenities, features, and elements are built into that so that we can address that movement and ensure the safety of both the vehicular traffic as well as the biology elements that will be crossing that as well. Improve conditions of the existing roadway. Now, this is going to be a yes. Yes, we're ripping it up. It's going to get better. So it's not one of those that we're going to say, well, you know, it's only going to get average. That's a pretty unequivocal yes, that's going to happen. Safer bike and pedestrian facilities. Going back to what I said, it's fully functional, right? We're going to have bike and ped facilities, right? Unless they're banned or prohibited. I-10 and 210 right now, I don't believe allow bikes or pedestrians. So we didn't want to say those are lumped, you know, even though right now they're all categorized as a capacity enhancement underneath that functional grouping. Can't say that all capacity projects are going to wind up with bike and ped facilities because some of them don't have them today. So we want to make sure that that's accommodated, acknowledged, and reflected there. The next two, though, of maintaining or improving air quality, improve access to workplace. These you're going to see consistent through there because if you're improving the roadway, if you're improving the traffic flow, you're improving the access to the different modes out there, yes, things are going to get better in air quality. A system that performs and operates maximum efficiency is going to have improvement on the air quality. That's just a given. We see that in analysis after analysis after analysis. So we know we can apply that here unequivocally. Same thing with access to workplace. If it connects today, it'll connect tomorrow and it'll be that much better. And then lastly, the functionality to keep corridors back to the bike, the ped, the transit. Generally, it's going to happen. Depends on most cases it will do that. And there's some cases hey, those are not allowed aspects, features, or modal uses on them, so they wouldn't be accommodated on that. Doesn't mean that the project is going to limit what it's supposed to do. It's not artificially constraining. It's saying those are not allowed activities on there anyway. Those have been restricted for safety purposes or general mobility. So that's kind of all. I went through that one a little longer than I did for the others. Wanted to paint the picture as that's kind of evaluation. And that's why you're going to see a lot of the generally, depends, things like that. Yes.
Thank you, Rick. Sorry, I'm going to shout into this thing again. How did we decide whether or not these things meet those goals? I'm looking, I mean, just for starters, reduce congestion generally, yes. Based on what projections are we taking into account induced demand? And same with pedestrian safety and transit. I mean, if we're promoting car ridership, we're not improving transit ridership. So how are we looking at future models on this, or is this like, how did we get there?
So it's a combination. Yes, it's future stuff. So this is looking at our current situation, but also projecting out to the future. So we're taking our typical design horizon. If I remember, I was associated with our RMAP exercise 2045. So we're looking at a future world. Now we're also looking at trends, patterns, habits, behaviors, everything else. Well, okay, if I've got 30,000 cars and I've got no transit routes, we're going to accommodate that. Now that's a discussion for the CAC. Well, do we want to significantly try to alter that? Maybe yes, maybe no. You're going to be getting into behaviors, patterns, and that's a bigger question on that. But we tried to also look at what's present, what's used out there, what is our demand associated with it? Do we have generators? So at a very high level, we don't do an in-depth analysis, but we're also applying then best practices. We know separated bike and ped facilities are inherently safer than trying to allow them to merge and mix and mingle. It's just general common sense, and studies bear that out. So we're going to put dedicated paved shoulders out there for the bike facilities, and we'll include at least some pedestrian aspect of it. Don't know exactly what it'll look like, but it will be a dedicated facility. We may not even design that in through our efforts here. We don't have to. We got to provide for it, acknowledge it in the estimate, and say, now the future design teams that get to go put it in, don't worry, we budgeted for it. We're planning on letting you have that stuff. So does that get to your question?
Yeah, Rick, let me just add one thing.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Tom.
We are going to have a conversation about induced demand with some specific technical presentation and conversation here within the committee within the next 2 or 3 meetings. But we have to bring it at the right time. When we can use it.
Relative to the last question and your response on improving transit ridership. And it is, yeah, you're right, it depends. But to the extent that just saying we're going to put transit out on a street, if the land use plans for the community, that particular community, don't show increased higher density of residential along those streets, this is where the land use and transportation most intersect in terms of the ability to improve transit ridership. That's it doesn't matter really just what you do with the road, it's the land use. So this I think plays in with what Tom just said, but the need to look at the land uses along those major corridors to see if they do that. If they don't do that, we have a problem, and we're not going to get transit ridership no matter what we put up there.
So those will all be things you'll definitely want to
Can I say that's not necessarily true? In the morning, there are, for instance, from Oro Valley to get to town and others, they have express buses.
Yes.
So if you put a improved roadway, you may open the opportunity to get from A to B, even though it in between may not be tremendous density of land use.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We'll take it.
And I think you guys are all dancing around the right thing. And to your point, Abby, there's going to be, or we're trying to factor all that in. We want to make sure we're looking at a future situation. How does it do all that stuff? And how does it accommodate That's the key thing. What's it going to be? What's our best guess on the projection on that? What are the potential for it to be based on either existing zoning codes, development activity, or proposed or pending or possible ones? So there's a lot of crystal balling on that, but it's a very inclusive crystal balling, if that makes sense. If that gets to your question. It's not as concrete. I wish I could give you this. Yes, this model does this, but I can tell you it's all factored in.
I think as long as this is tentative and we have these conversations and like educational opportunities so we can understand, like, I think this is really useful to have this as a list of goals and things that are being considered. They interplay in ways that we're not necessarily talking about because it's a short meeting and I really appreciate it. I'm
Yes.
on a jet, so I'll see you all.
I was going to say, as much as I wish I could say, okay, now here's the top 30 projects. But, okay, capacity. So some examples of this. I-10-210, I've talked about it a couple times. This is the one that proposes to reconstruct the roadway, additional lanes, meets current future demands, improve overall operations because they're doing a lot of interchange reconfigurations on this. Some of the key things on there it's going to do, it improves accessibility and connectivity. So it improves the conditions of the existing roadway. Check some of those goal boxes. So these are all things it's going to do, so you know it's going to nail that. It's not in an environmentally sensitive area, thus no reduction in wildlife crossing. So this is the kind of things that we've looked at and said, okay, it checks the boxes or why it didn't rank that or check that particular box. It's not, like I said, I want to leave the impression of, oh no, that's not important or that's being omitted. That's not part of the overall function and scope of that particular effort. Another example, and this to get to a point Tom brought up, Ina Road, I-10 to Camino de la Tierra, and the second project, which was Camino de la Tierra to Paseo del Norte. So you had one jurisdiction submitting the western piece, the other jurisdiction submitted the eastern piece. Very, very, very similar scopes, needs, and outcomes that are desired on that. It's a proposal to reconstruct the roadway, additional lanes for current and future demand, and improve overall operations. Remember, that's going to be part of a lot of these is we're rebuilding to improve how well it works as well, not just add those features elements. Improves accessibility, connectivity, the conditions of the roadway, not an environmentally sensitive area because already the CDO area is a great separation. The roadway goes over the top, so whatever wildlife is going to use the CDO is already in a protected, preserved, separated type of manner. And then improves the functionality by providing all the necessary bike ped and transit facilities. So that's an example. I wanted to run through that just to highlight what, okay, you saw these projects. I wondered why and how to define it. Now you know where it fits in. It's a capacity enhancement. Now you got a label to it, if you will, and a way to kind of say it goes in this box and fits in that one. All right, with all of that, I'm hoping now I can get through the rest of these a little quicker. Functionalization. So these are projects that are going to also reconstruct the roadway, but generally the existing capacity is adequate, meaning the lane configuration is working okay and carrying the volumes today, as well as what we expect tomorrow. What does that mean? It means it was probably built a little bit more robust than we thought it was going to be. Traffic just didn't materialize. That's okay. Sometimes that happens. All the models, all the projections of the world, still things are real life and what happens. But it's still missing and it's got deficiencies. The pavement may be falling apart. It was never designed to handle all that heavy loading out there. Or it, at a time, didn't have the transit. Now we're running a lot of transit use on it. Or we have since had a lot of development activity out there that's generated the type of pedestrian use there. Wow, we've got destination centers with recreational centers, libraries, schools. So we've seen an entire mode kick up that just didn't exist 40 years ago. So we run into those. We want to accommodate. We want to rebuild it, reconstruct it, and get that addressed as well.
Oracle Road is a good example.
Pardon me?
Oracle Road by the
Oracle
state.
Road would be a poster child for that. It was wide, middle of nowhere type of thing, and then you build everything else out and say, I can walk up to go get my groceries. That's the example. Okay, so functionalization. Out of the 108 projects, 25 fell in this category with a price tag about $500 million on this one. How do they line up on the CAC goals? You see generally across the board on this, they're going to reduce congestion because the congestion's not there. It's already functioning fairly well. What we've got are those operational impediments. What we've got are those things that hold you back. They're not meeting all those associated demands. Crosstown mobility is generally yes. Transit ridership, generally it's going to do that because that's a necessary key modal effort that will be brought forward as well. Crashes at intersections, wildlife, you heard me talk about depends. If it hasn't got a wildlife nexus, meaning it's crossing an environmentally sensitive area, we don't want to take credit for it just by saying, well, we're going to look at it. It's got to have that interface for it to be able to trigger and improve that component to it. Conditions of the roadway, safer bike and pedestrian facility. That's kind of meeting the definition. We're saying we want those things in there. Now, these are 5 broad categories. So as you go through individual, you may see some projects in there, they kind of needed a home. So they may be specific to just bike and ped. Okay, we didn't want to break and isolate just 1 or 2 small projects and go, wow, out of 108, these are stranded. But you may, as you go through, look at those and go, we may come up with different categories or sub-elements, or want to break them out a little further. So things to keep in mind. The one thing that you'll see consistent across all of them is the air quality and the access to workplace, okay? Because we're improving the transportation system. Those are always going to check those boxes. And then the functionality, as I mentioned, because that's what it's at. It's a functional type of roadway enhancement. That's going to be generally what it always does. Some examples on this one include the ones that have been submitted: Palo Verde from Bellevue to 44th. This proposes to reconstruct it with curbs, sidewalk, drainage, mill and fill the roadway, raised medians, hot crossings, all those things that will ensure now that all modal functional aspects are going to be met and addressed and function the way it's intended to in a safe and effective operations on that. Excuse me. Improves the functionality by taking care of the bike ped transit facilities, and improves the conditions of the roadway. So that's a couple examples of how it checks the boxes. Another example is Drexel Road from South 12th all the way over to Country Club. Same type of thing. It's going to have continuous accessible sidewalks, landscaping, lighting, traffic signals, enhanced bike lanes, safe crossings. Hitting upon those things that say, we've got the lane configuration for the cars, but what we don't have is all the other ways that are legally allowed transportation modes accommodated the way they need to. Oh, and then you got the way it checks the boxes on that. Okay, operational. These projects also generally reconstruct the roadway. Same thing, existing capacities generally, for the most part, is acceptable. It's working. The lane configurations carrying everything for the most part. There'll be some exceptions on that as we go through. Primary focus is to enhance your operations. Okay, so this is the elimination of at-grade drainage crossings, at-grade railroad. What's stopping me from operating as effectively and efficiently as I can? There's an impediment there. If you've ever driven down a roadway and you've been stopped behind 10 cars because the person, 11th car up there, is trying to turn left. That's an operational impediment. Everybody's dealt with the train crossing. I'm waiting for a train. Now I'm waiting for the second train. Now the third one parked and camped out here. So everybody's been through that. Monsoon season, can't pass Houghton Road, can't pass Sorry Road, pick a road. When you've been blocked or impeded by that, it works normally during dry conditions just fine. But during the wet conditions, it's been operationally impeded. It just doesn't effectively work as well as it is intended. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at on those. So in this category, we have got, out of the 108, 19 of them fall in this category definition, right around hovering about $500 million on this as well. Generally, these things will address congestion. Now, in some cases, you'll build it to a future setup on this. So some of the interchange projects, Portero, Moore Road, we're going to build the additional lanes out there for future growth development possibility. We're not going to replace it exactly as it's laid out today. So we'd work to make sure it's got upgraded for the future conditions and make sure it addresses that. Efficient crosstown mobility. Yes, if you got something blocking you, as you can imagine, it keeps you go from going crosstown. Transit ridership, crashes, wildlife, you heard me talk about that. These meet in the depends category because it really does depend on the circumstances, situations, and the configuration of the roadway. Does it improve the conditions of the existing? That one is going to be an unequivocal yes. We will make it better. So once this is done, rebuilt, and reconstructed, you've removed that operational impediment. And then the rest of them I won't go through each one, but that's you get the idea of how those work. So some examples of what these would be. The Cortero I-10 interchange. So this would basically do what we've done at Ruthroff, at Ina, at Prince, where we're flip-flopping the interchange. Today, it goes over the railroad tracks under the interstate. Tomorrow, it goes up and over both, and you remove that safety operational aspect of it. Don't get wound up in, well, that's a safer situation. Yes, it is a safer situation, but you may not be labeling it as a safety. That's where the operational phrase, that's probably a better overall description of that. That's why that phrase is chosen in there, even though there is a safety benefit. Never would want to dismiss that. you see how it checks the boxes. I won't go through that in detail. Los Reales, Sheridan Road from, which is also known as Ignacio Bomea, out of the Pascuaki tribe of De Oeste. This is basically wanting to reconstruct a 2-lane roadway into a 3-lane with all the necessary multimodal facilities, bike, ped, and giving you that 2-way left turn lane so that turning vehicles can now properly access and not block the main flow. So everything flows a lot more effectively, a lot more efficiently on that.
Excuse me, Chairman McGovern. Do we
Yes.
still have a quorum? I don't know how many people are on.
Yeah, we still have a quorum.
And I'm sorry, I'm running over, and I will see if I can speed these last ones up. New roadway connections, this is fairly self-explanatory. These are your brand new roadways on some sort of virgin alignment, or it's new segments that'll connect pieces out there. So it's not, don't think going blazing through the desert all on its own. There may be pieces that just haven't connected between two normal termini points. But it's big to come out there and saying, we don't quite have an existing roadway where we're at. So price tag on this one, there's 14 new roadway connection projects that have been submitted. Price tag is hovering right around $1.5 billion. I will say that 1 billion of that is taken up with Sonoran Corridor. Okay, so that's the one that's evolved, and ADOT's gotten to where they finished the EIS effort on that. We can now include that in there with a little bit more description in the updated cost estimate on that. So this one, a lot of it depends on this one, because a lot of it depends on what's happening with the surrounding network. Your existing roadways, in many cases, may not be overloaded. This is an alternative. If you have an incident, a major accident, something else blocking the other roadway, this gives you pressure relief. So in many cases, the existing roadway, there may be a single point of connection or a single point of access. Hey, a secondary one now gives options and ensures that overall availability and accessibility in there. So that's why you'll see a lot of that type of thing on congestion or crosstown mobility descriptions. Obviously, that depends on the rest of them. It depends on whether that's out there. Wildlife interface, a brand new roadway isn't going to have a wildlife interface on it. So, well, brand new virgin roadway versus, well, we're extending a connection. That's why we try to draw some distinctions on that. So you see how it checks the boxes across those various ones there. Some examples on this one include El Toro Road down in Sahuarita, which is going to basically connect La Cañada to La Vita. Construct sections of a new 2-lane roadway. It's going to have all the amenities with your curb, gutter, bike lane, sidewalks, and then go back on the existing, I believe it's a little 2-lane dirt road, and basically bringing that up to its full standard as well. So ensuring that you got full connectivity on that crosstown mobility. Sonoran Corridor, we've all followed that. You've heard me talk about that. That basically goes from the vicinity of El Toro interchange down on I-19 and connects out the east side on I-10 at Rita Ranch.
Hey, Rick, how much do you have in the 108 project budget for Sonoran Corridor?
I don't know the exact, no, I do know the exact.
At one point, there was a placeholder for $10,000. I don't know.
I couldn't deliver it for that much, so I did bump it up. I'm now carrying.
That's a deal. If you can go that for 10 grand.
Yeah, well, they changed it to $1. Okay.
Yeah, we tried to lower
Probably
it.
100 million.
Lost the beat.
Probably 110 million.
We did have a placeholder as this was submitted during the EIS effort.
It's okay, you don't need to look for it right now. I just let everyone know that many of these we'll be looking at and asking questions about, oh, really, is it that cheap? Well, no, not necessarily, but to do the studies to begin the project, perhaps. In other cases, like the I-10 projects, you may only have numbers on there which represent what would be a local match or a local contribution and not necessarily the entire cost of a given project.
969 million is what it says in our.
969.
And 500 million. Yeah, so and that's a key point, Tom Rod. Why did it grow so much from previous submittals? When it was in the middle of the EIS, we could not in any way influence. The EIS is an environmental impact statement, and that's a necessary study on any kind of big roadway corridor of this magnitude. And it's got a significant public involvement activity. And we as jurisdictions, as members, as charged and stewards of the public, can't influence it with passion or prejudice that may have an ability to affect the outcome. And putting a price tag in when it was in the middle of its study and feedback would be violation of that. So once it was done, finalized, then we plugged in the actual price tag that they gave.
Have you done these ratings on every one of the 108 projects?
Yes, for the most part. The ones that we did most recently with the city have gotten a lesser in-depth type of thing, but we worked with them to kind of say, all right, these are where they fall in that ballpark. So we've got the general groupings.
We're gonna get that information.
What's that?
Are we getting that information?
We could talk about that and see what all you'd want. The reason I'm hesitant on it is it took months and months and months. It was a lot of detail and a lot of paper. So,
So
we
it's
can work and see how
108
it would be helpful.
projects, yeah. It's very helpful to be looking at some of these projects.
We could definitely talk about that. Soren Corridor, you got it. That one's covered, that one. Transit capital. As I mentioned, these are the projects. They're going to build the capital portion of it, not just the operational with terms of service, hours, those type of things. So this is going to build something on that. And it's got a wide range on it from streetcar, trolley, high capacity transit. Out of the 108 projects on this one, I got to remember, 3 of them came in, price tag of about 60 million bucks. These are the goal evaluations. Like I said, reduce congestion. Depends if it's a congested roadway. So adding transit may not always be a congestion reduction. It may be for service, accessibility, those type of things. So you have the roadways doing okay. We just want to add that because it's a necessary piece to it. Now this is one thing about transit. This is a couple caveats on there. Generally, it's going to improve your crosstown functionality. The project submitted, one of them is a streetcar, and I'll talk more about that in a second. That's going through South Tucson, the HCT, the high capacity transit that's going to be running from the transit centers down to the airport. Does it reduce crashes at internet? Typically, transit capital jobs are very, very precise and specific in their scope. They're meant to do one thing and do it very well. So if you've got existing deficiencies out there or existing conditions, those would need to be evaluated to decide, hey, we've got to bring that along and upgrade that, or we'll handle that in a separate effort. Those are going to be discussions as we go forward on that. But generally, as its nature, it's there to address the transit part of it, not to correct sins from the roadway side. So that would have to be thought through as how that's going to be handled. And that's why you'll see some of these have got no's or not applicable. It's not going to fix your roadway. That's not the intent of it. It's here to upgrade the transit, not try to correct the past mistakes. And then you'll see the rest of them about how it checks off those boxes as well. Examples on this, the 4th Avenue from the I-10 frontage road to 26th Street, the Heritage Trolley Line coming in from South Tucson, proposes to reestablish the historical trolley line along the whole 4th Avenue alignment, and then would use the old Pueblo trolley to furnish the cars on that. So this is a proposal that came in. It would improve the ridership and the overall accessibility on that corridor through that section. Another example is the 6th Avenue, Ronstadt Transit Center to the TIA, high capacity transit. So this would put a bus rapid transit route from downtown to the airport, improving your transit ridership and make sure you get accessibility along the corridor. Okay, so that's examples of how that one falls in. This is the key thing, and I really appreciate your patience as moving forward on this. So what comes next? The whole idea wasn't to dump this in your lap and go, good luck with that. Call me. It is, here's some things to consider as a committee, as you work through, and as what Tom's going to talk through with homework assignments. Start sorting through. You'll think about these. Some of you did your homework in advance. I am going to get you guys a hobby. Thank you. Work collaboratively. So these are things going forward. You're going to want to work with TMC. Which projects align best with the goals, desired outcomes? They've seen this too. Okay, not quite as in depth. I gave them the much broad bridge version. I was saving it for you guys. I wanted you to have the fun. And the board will assist on this for defining regional goals with lists. So you can see now how these are going to interface with a lot of conversations and dialogue that are going on now. Ensure projects align with statutory requirements. You heard Jim DeGrood talk in the past about, here's the requirements. The law says this is what we've got to do. Here's some key requirements we can do. We just can't come into stuff with willy-nilly. It's got to meet those key aspects of it to be a legally binding and complying plan. Review and discuss the project descriptions for refinement. Point A to point B. You know what? It stopped at point B because that's a jurisdictional boundary. Go through the next big intersection, include those improvements, and Rick, would you refine that scope? Update that with the jurisdictions and update the cost estimate. You got it. Thanks for the good feedback. So those will be things that we'll want to look at is, does it have, cover, and address the things that need to be Just because the jurisdiction said that's the stopping spot, that may have been consistent with direction and guidance. You may look at that and go, what about, maybe there's a little bit better, more effective tie-in. Good discussion to have. We'll line up TMC or we'll present that and share that as we go forward. Identify any projects that should be addressed under other sub-elements. So you'll see in there that there are some of these projects, very, very specific scope features, maybe just bike and ped, or maybe just a roadway overlay. Okay, that's a very specific type of scope when all the rest of them were covering multiple aspects, functions, or operational aspects. You know what? That may slide into a sub-element. We would like to say, Rick, in addition to the 5 you've proposed, maybe here's a couple sub-elements, or maybe here's another broad category altogether. Those will be things you'll look at and say, how would that help us break these, categorize, refine them, all that type of stuff. So that's a possibility. The board will continually provide, as you heard General Maxwell talk about, with the additional direction on budget. As we go forward, we're going to be looking at complementary funds, supplemental funds, funds that potentially could be invested. One key thing, you've heard Farhad mention this, you heard Pocky mention it, it's got to be fiscally constrained. It can't be based on, well, we think there's going to be other funds out there in 10 years. Money in hand to match cost. It's got to balance. Can't be hypothetical, can't be based on speculative type of stuff. So we'll make sure we go through those efforts on that. And then reaffirming this last key thing. Once you've come up with a draft plan, then we go out and share with folks. Now you've got specifics to show them, specifics to hear back, feedback and comments, dialogue, and then get that engaging debate. So that'll be the last step on that is, hey, we've got a product, folks. Look at this. This is what it'll do. This is where it's located. And we've got those specifics to be able to share. Sorry for running late. Thank you for your patience. Sam, I'll leave it up to you as to I can answer any questions or support any dialogue you want going forward.
Thanks, Rick, very much. That was terrific. We have possible action here for coordination with the Technical Management Committee, but I don't believe, based on your presentation and the previous ones, that we really have anything currently that we need to pass on as a request to the TMC, at least not until we receive the information that they've been working on to date, and frankly, until we've done our work on the guiding principles. So, hearing no objection.
Sure, I just 2 information questions.
Sure, go ahead, Bruce.
I had mentioned earlier that the project descriptions that we received in the board packet don't include the jurisdiction. I just looked at it. I cannot find it on here. So it'd be helpful to get the jurisdictions. Right. And secondly, this is an incredibly helpful presentation. If we could get a copy of that, because it's a good point of guidance for us going forward. Rick, thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
You got it.
I'd like to second that.
Yeah, well done, Rick. Thank you.
I was going to say,
very
worth
much.
a wait for 2 months here. Hopefully, I didn't put everybody to sleep.
Well, the ones who are left are still awake, but
You know how to throw a compliment out there, man. That
have
left
to
me feeling
run for
good.
their afternoon nap. Okay, we'll take 5 minutes for future agenda items. Fire them up, but remember, you can always email me or Pocky with future agenda items. Do I hear any? As if the ones we've talked about today aren't enough.
How about a tequila service at some point?
Yeah, tequila service, that would be good. All right, thanks everyone, and appreciate your staying connected and engaged throughout this whole project, this whole meeting.
Thank you. That was
I'm afraid
really
that we may have other somewhat longer meetings as we go forward, and we appreciate your involvement.
Motion to adjourn?
I have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
And I have a second. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks from today.
Take care. Thanks, man.